CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy. After 2 years and more than 80 episodes of our Conversations on African Philanthropy, we are introducing a series of conversations that are theme-specific, program-focused, and at times recorded at the request of those at the coalface of implementation in order to document and tell their experiences and stories. In the first of such series, we focus on the Zimbabwe Alliance Initiative, whose grants, convenings, capacity building, and technical support have fostered a vibrant civil society, where partners were empowered to design innovative and coordinated responses that amplify the voices of those marginalized, influence the capacity of citizens to mobilize around national critical issues, engage with policymakers, and built regional and international solidarity in pursuit of a better Zimbabwe. Formed in 2010 to strengthen the role of civil society in influencing Zimbabwe's transition to democracy, the Alliance has evolved over several phases to what it is today. An initiative of several partners, Zimbabwe Alliance is a story of resilience, innovation, dedication, and passion expressed somewhat beautifully in some of the least expected places and ways.
Welcome to an episode that is focusing on the Zimbabwe Alliance, an initiative that was put together by a couple of donors, among them the Wallace Global Fund, way back at the time when Zimbabwe was, in a way, experimenting with the government of national unity. Some of the objectives of the fund and the alliance at the beginning was to strengthen civil society in a country that was meant to be going through a transition, but secondly, to provide re-granting facilities. Among those that were involved in the early beginnings of the initiative is Dorsey, the former executive director of the Wallace Global Fund and currently the senior advisor of the fund. Ellen, welcome to the conversations.
Thank you, Becky. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much. As we start, obviously this is a series that we are doing on ZimAlliance in an attempt to document the interventions, the experiences, the lessons, and as one of the people, but also one of the foundations of funds that were involved in the early beginnings of the initiative, I'm keen to get the history of the emergence of the initiative from one of the founders. I mean, part of what we have discovered is that there's very little written around the early beginnings of the initiative. And so it's been useful speaking to people like Cynthia, people like Briggs, and now we are very much excited to speak to you because you were one of the very first people to have this conversation and conceptualize the alliance. So maybe talk to us a bit about the history and how it came about, and then we can talk about the initial objectives, at least from the perspective of the fund.
Great, happy to do it. So I should say that Wallace Global Fund is a private family philanthropy based in Washington, D.C. Our donor was Henry Wallace, who was Vice President of the United States under FDR, an architect of the New Deal, and really an amazing champion of movements and progressive social change. And that's a fantastic DNA for our work. And the foundation's priorities are democracy, human rights, environment, and corporate accountability, women's rights and corporate accountability. And we had a kind of deep presence in South Africa, a country that I also had. I've had a long history of work in solidarity and living there. And so we had a pretty deep presence in South Africa, although no staff there. And we began to see both new opportunity and challenges in Zimbabwe, and wanted to figure out how we could play a supportive role in building out civil society's capacity to respond to the challenges, to respond to the new opportunities to promote democracy and human rights there. So in 2009, Wallace Global Fund helped establish the Zimbabwe Alliance as what we saw as being a unique model of funder civil society collaboration to support and grow the grassroots movement for democracy and human rights in Zimbabwe. And we saw this opportunity as a way of also addressing and augmenting our own capacity to do meaningful and appropriate work in country. And so we began in the earliest days partnering with a historic African solidarity organization based in the United States called Africa Action. Africa Action emerged out of two organizations that had been vital anti-apartheid leaders for decades in the United States. And Briggs Bamba was a staff person there, Briggs, from Zimbabwe. And we built a relationship and said we had already been funding Africa Action for the solidarity work, but we said we really felt like we could begin to get resources through Africa Action to Zimbabwe with Briggs's partnership and guidance. Then some changes happened at Africa Action, and Briggs had made the decision to return to Zimbabwe. So we started looking for a different model to do regranting and support under Briggs's leadership. We reached out to Trust Africa, and Professor Becky Moyo happened to be working there at the time. And so we began designing what became the ZimAlliance. And some of the resources that we had been programming through Africa Action, we now began to program through Trust Africa. So why did we do this? And why did we go about setting up the Zimbabwe Alliance? I think it's largely the first reason was the need and the opportunity, and that there was very little philanthropic money going to Zimbabwe. And what would go to Zimbabwe was largely going to big NGOs in the major cities or solely in Harare. And we knew from our work in the United States and around the world that that is not getting to communities in the way that it needs to. It's not going to building out deep knowledge and commitment to democracy and human rights and lifting up leaders, often not funded or resourced, who are doing the work in their communities, the transformative economic, social, and political work in their communities. So we wanted first and foremost to ensure that our resources went to community organizing and advocacy, economic and political education, nonpartisan voter education, cultural and artistic means of organizing, and get closer to the ground and further out, as it were, from the capital. And we also knew that we wouldn't have a capacity there. So we wanted, for a funder based in the US, no staff in Southern Africa, we wanted to make sure that that work was being programmed by someone who knew Zimbabwe, had deep relationships in Zimbabwe, and frankly was an organizer funder, because that's really what we were are. So we also felt we wouldn't be the only funder that wanted that kind of capacity and wanted to learn from what was happening. We were willing to experiment. We wanted to learn from what was happening on the ground. And we felt like it would be valuable to build out a table of like-minded donors who could learn from each other, learn from the work, and organize other funders to come in, because we knew that our resources would be relatively small and the need was so great, so little money was going to Zimbabwe that table could be a way to grow the resources, mobilize more resources. In fact, fast forward, at some point in the journey on the ZimAlliance, we even engaged a consultant to try and organize more money into the ZimAlliance, because in my efforts to reach out to larger donors, we often heard that they weren't interested in putting money into Zimbabwe because it was not considered a transitional country, meaning a country that was sufficiently in a process that would lead to an established democracy. That was a shocking realization for me, that funders that worked on human rights, worked on democracy, didn't think Zimbabwe had a chance and therefore weren't willing to put money into the country. That seemed almost immoral. So that just intensified our commitment to building out a kind of donor, civil society, collaborative, or at least a community of practice, of knowledge generation, of collaboration and sharing.
Yeah, so I mean, on that point on donors and the attempts to bring more donors, maybe let's take a back step a bit and talk about how, in the beginning, you were able to work with the Schooner Foundation, IDEX, and I think there was the Jewish Service as well there. How does that collaboration come about?
Yeah. Great. Happy to give our memory of that and our experience of that. So as we began this experiment, willing to launch this experiment of deeper re-granting, community organizing in Zimbabwe, we began to reach out to some like-minded donors, or donors that had already been working, supporting a few partners in Zimbabwe. So IDEX, which became 1,000 Currents, led at that time by Vinny, the Schooner Foundation, and Trust Africa, we began to form the management of the ZimAlliance. We began to interact as that community of practice. And I would say, as we began recruiting a few core funders and helped set up the steering committee for the ZimAlliance, which Becky was involved in, we also began, we supported Briggs, and our board chair, Scott Wallace, and his wife, Christy, traveled to Zimbabwe on a fact-finding mission. They set up meetings with civil society leaders on the ground, government officials, journalists, foreign embassies, et cetera, to kind of map out what both the challenges and the opportunities were. The first grant we made that went through Trust Africa, once we had shifted support from Africa Action, was to create a short educational video about the situation on the ground, to hire Briggs, provide staff capacity. And we felt that educational materials was a good way to recruit other donors, as well as be used as an organizing tool to really elevate the profile of what was happening in Zimbabwe. So that first grant led to an over 15-year partnership with Trust Africa, where we've provided 20 up to 25 grants with close to 2.5 million in funding.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.